Hi, welcome back, everybody. I'm Jack,
I'm Chelsea.
and this is the second episode of the Phoenix Files podcast on our first segment of Culture Shock. Today, we're going to be tackling true crime, what it is, its effects on individuals and communities, and a little bit about the ethics of the industry of true crime. So, hi, how you doing, Chelsea?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Can you tell us a little bit about true crime just to start off?
Yeah, I think the genre it's a little self-explanatory. It's real crimes that have happened to real people, and it's like really popular right now.
Yes.
Honestly, shocking how popular horrific crimes are. If you go on Spotify, if you look at the top 100 podcasts, it's consistently there's so much true crime in it, which is just so crazy to me.
And it's not just podcasts. We have Netflix shows, literature.
Yeah, it's all over YouTube.
All over YouTube. Yeah, and also not restricted to those forums. There's Reddit, subreddits, communities online. So yeah, as a genre, it reaches many formats and many forms. I've also learned that it's been around for a very long time. After the commercialization of printmaking in the 15th century, throughout the 16th century, specifically in the UK, there were a lot of independent pamphlets and literature that was written on the street that would reenact or retell crimes from the point of view of the perpetrator, which is something that we still see
Yeah,
today.
that's exactly how, I don't know, I feel like you look at a true crime documentary today, and it's going into, the motivations of the killer and, what they were thinking and, their relationship with their mom, all this stuff. That's so crazy that, tracing back the origins.
Yeah, and I also came across the fact of this literary kind of boom of true crime started in 1807 with the autobiography of Henry Tufts, who was an American criminal. He published his own autobiography in 1807, and it was a massive hit. And since then, so he was a bank robber. It was mostly robbery and escaping, running from the police. Wow. But even then, there was a big attraction to that and that sort of lifestyle.
Yeah.
And then since then, we've seen a lot of criminals kind of keep gaining or kind of extracting as much as they can from their...
Yeah, not only did he rob whatever, now he's making money off of telling the story of robbing people. That's crazy.
And people have been since then, really invested in understanding the point of view of crime perpetrators and trying to extract certain moral truths or universal truths about our behavior through true crime. I think that that's been kind of the biggest or most prominent argument for or in behalf of true crime has been that we get to learn something about our safety and about the people who are committing these crimes through the genre of true crime. But that's very much up for debate.
We'll get into that.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to ask you if you ever consume true crime. What's your experience with true crime, etc.?
Yeah, so I got really interested in true crime at a decently young age. I used to watch BuzzFeed Unsolved is really popular, and I loved it. I watched it all the time. I still watch it sometimes. And it kind of spiraled into listening to a lot of true crime. But I began questioning it about a year ago, because I'd had a couple instances. I remember one time I was listening to this true crime podcast. I think it was Crime Junkie, which is one of the most popular ones out there. And I was working with my dad, and I have my headphones in. I'm not paying attention, and then he comes up to tell me something and scares the living daylights out of me. And I was like, whoa, because as it should, because I was listening to someone getting murdered.
Yeah.
And so, but moved on and whatever, laugh it off. And then, about a year ago, I was watching. There was this YouTube channel I got really into watching. I can't remember her name, but she would do those get ready with me videos, and I just took a moment and was sorry, I'm listening to a woman talk about just a random grisly murder. It wasn't a super famous case, it was just a random case, while she's doing her makeup, and I was this is weird, and it I as I was kind of going through this like weird awakening, sort of, I came across like a video essay on YouTube about why true crime is like bad and we probably shouldn't be consuming it. And it just really like opened my eyes, I guess, about like some of the negative effects and things that I was experiencing, like anxiety and like paranoia.
Okay. And do you feel like that's an isolated case for you, or do you think that's a general effect that true crime has on people?
I think you'd be crazy if you listened to true crime all the time and you weren't anxious and paranoid about everything.
Okay. I agree. And I think that anxiety and paranoia is a recurrent phenomenon that happens in true crime. But although I wouldn't argue this personally, I think the strongest argument for true crime is that we generally want to know the dangers that we face. And true crime, for many people, puts them in the right state to act if they were to come into a situation where they start to notice a certain pattern that they've learned from true crime. It gives them the sense of security that they would know what to do in those situations. So it's like a way of preparing mentally, perhaps physically, for the environment that they live in.
Yeah.
What do you think of that sort of argument?
I don't think it's a great argument. I think if you are worried about being a victim of a crime, I think there's much better ways to prepare yourself for that. Like go to a self-defense class, do literally anything else. It's just such a weird argument because like if you were worried about drowning, you wouldn't go watch videos of Olympic swimmers, right? Like if anything, what you're learning from true crime is like how to commit a crime.
Yeah.
Like, because that's the focus, right? It's not focused on the victim most of the time.
Yeah.
It's focused on the killer, how they did it, why they did it. Like, if anything, you're learning how to get away with murder.
I agree, and I think that that's a strong argument, but I think from what I was reading online, for women specifically, reading into true crime is a way of understanding some of the societal and like structural sort of, I don't want to say enemies, but constituents that keep them from living like a harmonious and safe life. So investigating these forces that in society that harm them is a way of preparing and fighting against that. So I think that there is value in feeling prepared, even though it's not actually preparing you physically or mentally. Do you think that it holds true that if you wanted to learn how to self-defend yourself, that you have to know what are the dangers that you're facing?
I think that's a good point. I just think that there are better and healthier ways to learn about the dangers that you face.
I totally agree in that case, but not because of true crime as the YouTube or literary or documentary genre, but more about its form and its emphasis on the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And its desire to desensitize us to the victims and to the victim's experience. I think that is the strongest case against true crime.
Yeah, is the desensitization.
Yeah, and I think that that's a huge topic. From your point of view, do you think that like true crime desensitizes us to the lived experience of the victims, or do you think it puts us more in tune with the real experiences that people are having?
I don't know, because I think it definitely does desensitize people to violence, because there's any type of crime that you could think of, any horrific nightmare scenario that you could think of, there's gonna be a case like that that's happened, and the chances are you're gonna be able to find content about it. And the more that you watch true crime content, the regular cases aren't going to be interesting anymore. Because once you've heard of 10 different murders, murder's not going to be very interesting anymore. So it's that like ramping up of violence that I think is really dangerous to like desensitize yourself to. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that it's very real because as a true crime ex-consumer,
Ex-consumer.
I did notice.
Cover true crime.
Yeah, I did notice myself feeling less emotionally impacted by the cases.
Yeah.
So I think that, and I think this is not just the case for true crime, but any sort of violent media, that it does two things. It profits off of our attention span, and it also profits off of the lived experience of traumatized people.
Well, yeah, and on that like triggering traumatized note, like if you're not the type of person who's desensitized to violence and you come across true crime in some way, there's some horribly triggering things. Like there's some horrific stuff. And obviously if you're watching like a documentary on YouTube or a podcast, there's probably going to be trigger warnings. Or but if you're watching something that has less production value, you have no idea what you're going into, right? Yeah. And you might come out of that experience severely triggered and re-traumatized from something that you've experienced before.
Yeah, and I agree. But as we were having this conversation, I came up to a point, or I'm thinking of, not because there is this media, remove the media of true crime. Are the crimes still happening? And I think yes, exactly. Yeah. So true crime isn't inciting any sort of like violence. It's just desensitizing us to it. Yeah. Right? So the violence is there. So to say that true crime is desensitizing us from it, I think is just making us enjoy it. More than, because we're still susceptible to, we're still susceptible to violence. Yeah. So I think the question comes, how do we make true crime ethical for the consumer, the victim, and all of the like extra strings that get entangled in that? Exactly. Yeah.
So regardless of whether or not we think that consuming true crime is good for us, is it really ethical to even be making this kind of content?
Yeah, that's a very big question, a very big topic. So we're not going to center around discussing ethics, right? But we should focus on like the treatment of people. Is everybody being acknowledged, and is their experience being portrayed accurately? If we can agree on that as our foundation of ethics, I think that we can have a fruitful discussion. And I think that it is possible to have ethical true crime. However, I think that there is certain limitations when it comes to the commercialization of true crime. I think that's where the ethical boundary becomes a little bit blurry.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of the selling merchandise about true crime, highlighting the perpetrator, dehumanizing the victims by, like not mentioning their name, building conspiracy theories around a case that's unsolved, bringing living victims into the equation, framing them for something that they might have not have done.
Yeah.
We have to be very careful with how we treat the people involved in these cases because, well, first of all, many of them are alive and they're still continuing to live their life. And so the way in which we talk about these crimes can impact their current situation.
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at whose story is being told. And not even just in a perspective way. Like, obviously, most true crime is focusing mostly on the person committing the crime.
Yeah.
But what victims are we choosing to highlight?
Yeah, who's being criminalized in a way.
Yeah, and who's being victimized too, though, because the majority, at least in my opinion and from what I've seen, of true crime content is seeing women as victims of mostly male violence.
I see.
And I think that's a huge issue. I think it's a huge issue that people are profiting off of violence against women. I mean, I can't paint it in any better light. I also think it's important to look at what kinds of women are being highlighted as victims. Because, I mean, the vast majority of these stories that are being told are white women.
Yeah.
And there's this focus on like good victims. Like I always think of the example of like the JonBenet Ramsey case, which is like this little girl who was like tragically killed in her house. I'm not trying to make light of that at all. Like obviously it's horrific and tragic. But that case gets so much coverage on the news at the time, and then even now, like years and years later, people are still making videos about it. They're still making podcasts about it. But like the type of woman that is not going to get a true crime video made about her, like we talk about JonBenet Ramsey, you're not going to talk about like a sex worker who was murdered because she's not a good victim. Like
I see what you mean. Yeah. But okay, so do you think that that is, and ethically speaking, like should we even be considering this? But most of the audience is white women as well. Yeah. So do you think that that's a demand that's being filled by the industry, or the other way around? Because is it like big corporate or, you know, even low production industry fulfilling that desire of like the demographic of white women wanting this true crime? Or do you think it's an inverse effect of like there is so much true crime against like true crime where white women are the victims that white women become the audience?
I think it might be a little bit of both. I think the key point is that like trying to gain like sympathy for the victim, and you're more likely to be sympathetic towards someone that you can relate to on whatever level.
Somebody
right?
in group.
If you're if you're a young woman in your 20s and you're white, you're gonna sympathize with the girl in your true crime podcast who's in her mid-20s and has a really white sounding name, because they're probably not gonna tell you what her race is.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? Like that. It's. I'm not saying it's a good thing, obviously, but you're more likely to feel sympathy towards people that you relate to with on those like very basic levels.
So are we saying that there should be more representation of victims within true crime genre?
That feels weird to say too, because like, I don't know. I mean, if you're gonna make true crime, I guess make it inclusive, right?
Yeah,
But it just, I don't know. Talking about murdering people is just a weird thing to say. We have to talk about everyone getting murdered, because like.
Exactly, and that was my point.
Yeah.
Because like when we come into like the discussions of ethics, I was like, are we making money off the violence against women? Is that what true crime is about? Yeah. That's question number one, and we can agree that yes, there is a huge industry that is making money off of the violence against women. Then there's this other point of representation within true crime. Yeah. There is a huge industry making money off of women, off of white women enjoying and in this cycle of being entertained by murder of white women. So should the audience of these crimes kind of like take a step back and consider these are real crimes that were committed against real people? I should perhaps not be looking for this as entertainment. Do you think that it's a question of the audience to take in, or do you think it's an industry question? Like, should we be promoting and be putting so much production into this sort of a genre?
Ooh, I don't know. I mean,
because if the market's there, the market's gonna profit.
Exactly. Yeah. If there's demand, there's gonna be supply. So I think it does come down to the audience. Like, if you care about these issues, if you care about violence against women, maybe you shouldn't be listening to content that's profiting off of that.
Okay. So how do you consume true crime ethically? How do you go about consuming a true crime that respects the victim and that doesn't monetize off of their lived experience?
I think you have to be really picky about the true crime that you consume.
Okay. What does that mean?
You have to. So an example is a show on Netflix called Worst Exes Ever, and I think there's a couple other like spin-offs of it, like Roommates and that type of thing. And it's told from like the victim's perspective.
Okay.
I watched, for transparency, I watched one episode of the exes one. I watched the second episode, and it is the victim of this crime sitting in front of the camera and telling you what happened. And I think that's got to be the most ethical way to do it, right? Because because and obviously she's part of the production, so she's going to be profiting off of it. Someone else isn't profiting off of this horrible thing that happened to her, right?
Okay.
I think another big ethical issue is the romanticization that happens a lot of the time. Like, there's really famous cases of, like, women sending fan mail to, like, Ted Bundy, which...
Yes, an infamous serial
killer of women. And yeah, like, having fans and, like, people cheering and stuff, like, which is absolutely horrific to think about.
It really is. What do you think this is due to? The romanticization, and, like, what other ways does it exist in true crime? Does it just exist, like, in a sexual way? Is it like a support for their actions? What is romanticization of true crime?
I don't know. I honestly think for women, it's a bit of a coping mechanism.
Okay.
Like, I think maybe it has to do with the fact that they feel so threatened by this type of a situation where their brain just completely flips it on its head and is like, no, I'm actually attracted to this, or something weird like that. I think an interesting lens to look at romanticization of crime is through something like Narcos, which isn't like your typical, like, true crime, but it is true crime.
And in what way is it, like, romanticized, do you think?
So,
a little bit of context: Narcos is a show on Netflix about drug smuggling and drug cartels and their actions, their personal lives, etc.
Yeah, so I've only seen Narcos Mexico. I haven't seen, like, the original. But I mean, it's they live a glamorous life, right? Like, they're the owners of drug cartels. They're, like, very rich people. I think if you watch the first half of a season of Narcos where everyone's starting to sell drugs and make money and get rich, I think that would seem very romantic.
Yeah.
But if you watch to the end and you see the fates of these people, I don't think it would be very romantic. But yeah.
So you don't think there is that sort of romanticism, like Scarface, the famous movie, right? This sort of, like, death at the top with all of your wealth. So romanticization to you is like this ability to kind of desire that lifestyle. Is that what it means? Is there any other examples that you can talk about, like the romanticization in true crime? Like, in what other ways does it exist? Is it just about the life? Is it about the person?
I don't know about romanticization. I think Gypsy Rose Blanchard is also an interesting case. Who she was horribly abused by her mother and ended up killing her mother, and went to jail. And now I'm sure everyone is aware. You've probably seen, like, on Twitter and Instagram and stuff, she's recently come out of jail and she's, like, super famous. She's been given, there's, like, a deal for, like, a reality TV show. A reality TV show for a person who murdered their mother.
I see.
Which I don't know if that's romanticization, but it's got to be related somehow.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting dichotomy between, like the romanticization versus, like, the demonization, where we can look at a case like Gypsy Rose and give this girl so much sympathy and fame and wealth.
Yeah.
But then contrast it to a really similar case of the Menendez brothers, who were also horribly abused by their parents and ended up killing their parents. And they're likened to Jeffrey Dahmer. Like, there was Netflix Literal Monsters. Yeah, the Netflix I don't know if it's a series. There was a series about Jeffrey Dahmer called Monster, and then I think it's somehow under the same category of, like, Monster, and now they're calling the Menendez twins monsters.
So you're, like, interested in the, like...
Yeah, like, what's the difference? These people were all horribly abused by their parents and murdered them violently, but Gypsy Rose gets famous on Instagram and Twitter, and people make TikToks and memes about her.
Yeah.
But then the Menendez brothers get called monsters. Like, I don't really get it.
Yeah. That's a good point to make. I mean, I think that has a lot to do with the audience being, you know, a woman. You probably want to support other women through the experience of going through jail, and most likely the generally women audience want to see men pay for the crimes that they've committed. So there's a little bit of a bias there as opposed to how do you react to these crimes, right? I don't have much to say about that from my perspective, but I think it's a good point to bring up, this romanticization and demonization depending on the gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic background of the criminals. We then associate if it was worth it or not worth it, justified or unjustified. And I think that that's a good point to bring up when we consume true crime. Is this an ethical lens to look at it? Are we demonizing, glorifying, romanticizing, etc.? So overall, if you're like just watching this episode, what are some of the takeaways that you would like the audience to get from this?
I think I would want people to be really critical about the content that they consume and their relationship with violent content.
Yep. I totally agree. I think violent content has permeated kind of everything. It's obviously reflects a lot of our own biases as well. So I would also encourage for people to cross-reference a lot of the kind of conclusions that true crime makes about the cases that are being discussed. So don't blindly believe certain conclusions that people come upon, like this must have happened for them to commit this crime, etc. Finally, I would like to encourage people to remember that these are real people and real victims in real cases, some of them who are still living. So the
family members who are still living.
Exactly. So the rhetoric, just be respectful of the people who are still living, because your dehumanization of them is going to contribute to like the cycle of violence, etc. So I think that that's a good note to end on. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I think these are really important conversations to be having.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad that you guys are interested in listening to them.
I think so too, yeah.
And engaging in this kind of a conversation. So moving forward, our next episode is going to be about decolonization. It's going to be coming out on November 5th. So that should be
in about 2 weeks.
In about 2 weeks from now. And yeah, just be sure to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, subscribe here on YouTube, and like the video. It would really help us out. And thank you guys so much for watching.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.